I should declare a direct interest in this work at the outset, because I've been working for the Pacific Islands in these negotiations since 2007. So I've been kind of watching from the negotiation room itself, attending WTO meetings, looking at this. And so I've watched very closely India's policies and positions on this, and well, all of the other countries too. I should also flag at the outset that this negotiation has gone from being extremely high ambition, like trying to regulate a lot of things, to being very low ambition. And as Ranja made clear, the final outcome is very thin compared to what was anticipated at the outset. So I'm just going to do a few things. I'm going to talk just briefly about this logic, the claim that there will be a triple win from the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Then I will talk about the political economy, the commercial and power relations in negotiations. And then I'll look at the text of the draft agreement just before MC12, when the Ministerial Conference 12 in June, as Ranja said, that's where the agreement was agreed, and the actual text. So just to show the differences and explain why they happened. So the logic of the triple win is based upon well-known problems in fisheries, something that you all know about, the kind of high levels of overexploitation or fully exploited. We also know that on a global scale, marine capture, it grew rapidly, but is now stagnated, and value and production, the cost of fishing continues to increase, subsidies continue to increase. So there's an intensification of the attempt to extract a fish or species that are themselves declining, which is of course contradictory. And underpinning the WTO negotiations is the extremely large subsidies that are provided on an annual basis, at 20 billion a year, the World Bank estimates, and a large number of fisheries wouldn't operate without this. And just to be very, very clear at the outset, the vast majority of these billions of dollars of fisheries are provided to industrial fishing. A significant minority is provided to small-scale fishing, but the small-scale fisheries are subsidized, but arguably they are not the primary problem. And of course, if we take this historically, going back to the 150 years or so of industrial fishing, of course, it's Europe and North America who are the primary problems. But it's really important that this is not understood as a developing country versus developed country politics now, because it is not. That's just not true. And I'll explain why in a minute. The way that the policymakers, the policy wonks in the WTO justify the triple win is around distortion that, that subsidies provide for production of fish, i.e. they can be produced where they are non-profitable. And if the free market was at work, which of course is a construct, but if the free market was at work, and then companies would simply become non-profitable without the subsidies because they would be not catching enough fish. Of course, subsidies, and I think this is fairly uncontroversial, subsidies certainly do drive unsustainable fishing practices, and subsidies threaten food security and foreign exchange. So for example, imagine a subsidized European boat coming into West African waters, or a subsidized Chinese boat coming into West African waters, competing for that fish, undermining coastal fisheries. So this all creates an uneven playing field. So that's the big picture context. Now, the way that countries organized around this was in four main blocks. What I'm using the French word demandeurs, but that means those who are demanding rules. There are primarily the US, New Zealand, Australia, but there were other developing country demandeurs as well, and they were primarily the Latin American countries. Then there are the defensive countries that want to maintain their ability to subsidize their fishing fleets, the EU, Japan, and then there are the developing countries that are very defensive of their fishery subsidies, but for very different reasons. The Chinese government wants to continue to subsidize its distant water fleet on a global scale. India, historically, of course, is subsidizing fishing within its own EEZ. But I don't think that we should discount the fact that the Modi government very much wants to expand its industrial fishing capacity within the EEZ and regionally. Now, all of these countries use this idea of the triple win, gains for environment, development, and trade, to justify their position. So I won't go into this in detail, but because I can't in the time I have. But the point is they all have a kind of moral development, economic justification for why they want to carry on maintaining their positions. I'm going to show you now just a little bit of information. It's a little bit old, sorry, but it's the same trends. And this information shows you, first of all, the volume of commodity production, so that's the finished fish products, by the developed countries demanding fishery subsidies agreements, so they're big producers of fish, and the value of harmful fishery subsidies, so about 2 billion a year. Now, their position on fishery subsidies negotiations as relatively small subsidizers, now, historically they were major subsidizers, but now as relatively small subsidizers that don't have a developing country interest because they're rich developed countries, so they want strict rules, stopping everyone else, and they don't want significant special differential treatment. Now contrast this to the Latin American countries, of the 6 LATs is a group of Latin American countries. Now they have, again, a very significant volume of global fish production, commodity production, but their subsidies that are considered to be harmful are relatively small, even compared to the US, New Zealand, Australia. So they want a broad ban, they want strict rules. And so from a developing country perspective, they want to stop the rich countries from being able to continue to extract from the ocean using subsidies, but they also want to stop advanced developing countries like China to be able to do the same. And so they only want a moderate special and differential treatment. Now contrast this with the big rich countries, the OECD countries, who are defensive historically. That's the EU and Japan and Korea and others. And they have a very significant proportion of global commodity production and a vast harmful subsidies you can see here. So they don't want to have strict subsidy rules, and they also want limited special and differential treatment because they do not want developing countries like China to have a better position than them. And then unsurprisingly, China, India, as you know, China is the largest producer of fish in the world by a very large margin. And so the number grows in terms of the volume of world fish production and the value of harmful subsidies. And so developing countries want strict rules because they want to block the EU and Japan and others, but they want strong special differential treatment because they want to have, for good historical reasons, the ability to be able to develop their own fisheries. Now, consider that China is a developing country like India, but it's the largest producer of fish in the world, about 15% of global production. And it wants to have strong special and differential treatment for itself. Now, from the perspective of the developed countries and the developing demandeurs, like the Latin Americans, this is unacceptable. So really, the politics of this negotiation was primarily about China. So just to kind of, sorry, there's lots of text here, but I'm going to zoom in on some key things. These are the main kind of points of the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, the main sections. And this is not just my own work, this is work for Christopher Noonan, who I work with a lot, who's a fisheries lawyer and trade lawyer. Now, the thing I want to emphasize here is the 3 pillars that Ranja pointed out earlier. So this is the subsidies contributing to IUU fishing, the subsidies regarding fishing on stocks that are already overfished, and then subsidies contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. So subsidies on a stock that is known to be, where overfishing is known to be occurring, okay? So if a stock is healthy, then this agreement does nothing, okay? It's irrelevant. But if a stock is overfished or overfishing is occurring, that's when these disciplines come in. So that's really important to keep in mind, at least for the overfished and overcapacity and overfishing. Now, the IUU fishing, of course, is a big controversy because, as I'm sure you all know, I'm wrapping up. Do I have another 2 minutes? Thank you. So as you all know, the illegal, unreported, and unregulated kind of policy framework was very much pushed by the developed countries, and it's a mess. It's a legal mess. It's extremely complicated, and it's very difficult at the WTO to actually delineate these different parts, which is very often why they separate out the illegal and the U, because it's too difficult to do in practice. But what ended up happening here is because of the politics of advanced fishing nations, so including China, including the EU, who want to be able to access developing countries' waters, the obligations under this rule really put a lot of weight on coastal states. And advanced fishing nations, so distant water fishing nations, have a lot of discretion about when they can withdraw their subsidy or not. Now, Ranja mentioned the point on the biologically sustainable level. Now, the way that the developed countries drew up what is to be biological sustainable is they started from MSY. But actually, we managed to change that. So now the rule is MSY as one possibility, but alternative kind of measures are also allowed, commensurate with the data available in that country. So in other words, traditional knowledge used by fishers could also be used if sufficiently justified. So there's important space in this text that requires understanding. And then, of course, as Ranja already pointed out, there was the overcapacity and overfishing rule, and this was the most controversial by far. For many years, we were talking about IUU fishing. For many years, we were talking about overfished, but the big deal at the WTO was overcapacity and overfishing, because this is where the billions of dollars of subsidies are being sent. And this was the real politics of the negotiation. Now, as Ranja made clear, there was an advanced country carve-out where if a country could demonstrate that it had measures in place to ensure the sustainability of stocks, then it could continue to subsidize. Now, of course, that is a massive benefit for a lot of rich countries. There are other issues here. The subsidies contingent on fishing outside of their own EEZ. This is basically to catch China's distant water fishing. And this big one that's important to mention now is that any fishing outside of the EEZ or not under an RFMO to high seas fishing would be banned. And there was this big debate around whether or not there should be a ban on subsidizing foreign flagged vessels, the flags of convenience problem, which was an attempt to use the WTO to regulate this. And there was a wide range of discussions around special and differential treatment, or SDT. Just very quickly, the big deal actually in the end, and I'll come to this very quickly in the end, is that notifications demanded for transparency are actually the real story in the final agreement. So when the Green Room happened, India said, no, we're not going to sign this at all because you haven't been listening to us. And it's true. There was insufficient reflection of India's interests in the texts, even though India had made very clear. And so what happened is in the Green Room, all of the rich countries and the advanced, the major developing countries got together in the Green Room and signed something. Now, this worked against smaller developing country interests. So the Pacific Islands and others stood up and said no. And so the reason why the text looks like it does, and the reason why you have the sunset clause, is because of smaller developing countries saying this deal as it stands does nothing to deal with subsidies, which it doesn't. And all it does is put considerable disproportionate burdens on coastal states to record fisheries, a wide range of fisheries activities, and they had the notifications reduced as a result. Now, in the end, the only thing that negotiation produced, except for on IUU, which I talked about briefly, and except on overfished stocks, which is a very weak discipline, is to ban subsidies on any fishing that's outside of an EEZ or outside of an RFMO. And so in the end, after decades of negotiations, that's the outcome. Now, the question here is, for small-scale fishers, strategically, do you prefer to allow a free-for-all in subsidies and to continue to drive down stocks? Or do you prefer a more targeted approach? For example, an approach that would support certain categories of fishing activity, but not perhaps the industrial kind of big, high-profit, politically connected industries. And I think that's a really important differentiation for two reasons. One, to move beyond this simplistic developed versus developing country narrative, which is just not true. And secondly, to think about what matters most to your interests as a set of fishing communities and a set of fish workers.